Might have to mute myself in a second too. All right, it looks like we are live. Walter, go ahead.
All right. Hey, everybody. I think Corey is off now, and if y'all be patient with me for a second, I'm going to try to find myself on the social media stream. There I am, so I can monitor the comments. If you want to let me know who's here, that'd be. Y'all be patient with me for a second. I'm going to try to find myself on. Now I'm going to mute myself here, so I'll loop that. All right, I found myself on Facebook. Now let's see. Here we go. Got YouTube. All right. So while we've got this scheduled for just 30 minutes, but I think we could go up to an hour if people still want to talk. The idea behind this, actually, our communications director, Corey Fleeman, who played guitar for us this morning, suggested this months ago, really, to have kind of a follow-up time from the sermon where things that kind of got left on the cutting room floor could get discussed. And in light of everything going on, in light of the stuff we talked about this morning, it seemed like we need more dialogue and not less. And there were several questions that came up this morning that we didn't get to. And so I want to touch on some of those, but if there are other questions you have, go ahead and feel free to start filling up the feeds, and I'll get to them in a minute. One quick thing that I want to say is just to remind you that I'm a pastor and not a political scientist or a strategist of that nature. So I'm trying to facilitate a discussion from the perspective of our faith without pretending to be an expert on some of these things. And as I confessed this morning, I've spent so much of my life, frankly, trying to stay out of politics and ignore it, that there's a lot that I just don't know. So maybe that's a good place to start with a few follow-up questions from this morning. There was at least one that came up directly asking about Christians voting specifically over the issue of abortion. And then there were at least two more that came up asking that same question. Diane asked, how do you weigh a candidate's pro-abortion advocacy along with their other campaign platform issues? Emily asked, why is the church not speaking out about abortion during this time? Abortion is the #1 killer of Black lives. 850 Black babies die every day. And so I said that I'm planning to preach another sermon, separate sermon on this question in a few weeks. And one of the reasons why I didn't say anything about it earlier this morning is because I haven't studied it politically, in terms of I haven't studied how this issue is grappled with in the political sphere. So just to very simply, like the ballots, that the absentee ballot that I'm gonna have to hand deliver on Tuesday does not have on it a vote, are you for or against abortion, right? It's wrapped up in the political process. How do you think about changing Supreme Court justices? And, is Roe versus Wade overturnable? And has the federal government relate to the state? And I'm aware of a lot of those complexities, but frankly, I'm just not as educated on them to know, okay, this is how all that works. So let me say this. As a Christian, I think the basic issue of should a mother end the life of her unborn child is in its simplest form very straightforward. The answer is no. If you're a Christian and you ask me that question, should I do this? I would say absolutely not. In fact, if part of what we were talking about this morning is how Christians ought to care about all people, and as an extension of the heart of God, especially people who are vulnerable. And part of what I was arguing about the race problem in America right now is that there's African Americans especially have vulnerabilities right now because of the issues that are systemic in our culture. And so if we care about them and their vulnerability, do we care about the unborn, who are the absolute most vulnerable humans there are? And so on the basic moral level, I think abortion is wrong, and I can't comprehend a Christian argument that would justify it for any reason. Now, I know that it gets more complicated than that when you imagine particular scenarios. Like one that comes to my mind that I don't know exactly how to deal with is like, what do you do with when a mother's pregnant and in the process of the pregnancy, the doctors determine that the child has some sort of disorder that gives the child 0% chance of survival? And does the mother carry that child to term or not? And I've known mothers that have made that choice to do that out of that respect for the sanctity of life. But I raise it purely as a reference to like, there are complexities to it, and there's certainly complexities to how do you think about the political side of it. So that's the stuff that I want to bone up on later on. And in truth, it's very possible that if I educate myself more about this, I'm going to get more passionate one way or another about it. So as I study it, I encourage you to study it as well. And I hope that's a start to answering that question. So just check and see if anything is popping up. All right, so I am going to try to respond to a few other questions. And Connor has been putting out some really great ones. So Connor asked, in a city like Atlanta, where the majority of the political leaders and police force are Black, how do we fight for racial justice here in Atlanta? What should change in the system? And I think it's a great point to highlight about Atlanta, that our political leadership is dominated by African Americans as the majority culture in the city of Atlanta. And I didn't know that about the police force, but I'm not surprised that that's the case as well. And to say what should change, I mean, I've read some about the incident a few days ago where I think it was a couple of Atlanta University Center students that were pulled out of a car and tased, and the police officers have already been fired. The main thing that seems to me, and that needs to change about the policing in general, I made reference to this morning, is developing a more constructive relationship between police and citizens. So it seems to me, and I've read a number of things about this, that Black or white, police are often trained to control situations. That control is one of the sort of primary objectives of policing, and that where racial tensions run high, where distrust of the police runs high because of some of the things that we've seen in the last few weeks, that if somebody's agitated, that the police are asking them to do something or whatever, that it tends to escalate. The police officers tend to want to control more, and that it leads to a more volatile relationship. So that's that's a guy that's been trying to pay attention to the news for a while and make some sense out of things. That's something that I think needs to change. In other words, it's not, I wouldn't say it's specifically that like, well, every white and Black cop is racist or has deep racist sentiments, but that something about the culture of policing is problematic. And I will mention, actually, Corey and I were talking about this beforehand, but Malcolm Gladwell is a guy that I've been reading for many years. He's got a podcast called Revisionist History. And he has a chapter in his book from a few years ago called David and Goliath that he publishes the audiobook of this one chapter on his most recent podcast. And it's about this sort of relationship between people in power and people that are being policed, and how that sort of control strategy inevitably tends to backfire. And his opening illustration is about Northern Ireland in the 70s. So it's not explicitly a race thing, but more, all kinds of tensions that go on. What's the sort of strategy toward keeping the peace, right? That's what justices of the peace are supposed to be all about, that is actually effective. So yeah, that's a first stab at that. I'm really wishing Abram and Latanya or somebody else was here with me. Here's a related one that I think is very important. Chrissy asked, how do we separate issues of morality and justice, like the killing of innocent Black men, for example, and social and political strategies like affirmative action? Can we pursue the first and not the second? And those are both, again, complex political realities. Affirmative action. There's another thing that, we've all been reading about that for a long time, but I would need to study it more to have much of an informed opinion about it. But in general, I would say, and this is part of what I was arguing this morning as a Christian, is that we don't have to vote in a package. This is an argument. Actually, I watched a webinar from a guy named James Mumford on Friday, and Mumford is actually his famous brother, Marcus Mumford and Sons. But James Mumford is an English guy who's recently written a book called Vexed, and the subtitle is something like about political engagement beyond our tribes. And one of his main arguments is that Christians have been sold this, or voters in general have been sold this idea that you have to vote in a package, like a party has this whole set of platforms, and it's either take the whole thing or don't take it. And so I think any issue like this, affirmative action and racial justice in the criminal sphere, or with criminal justice, I think they absolutely have the potential to be separated, because if they're both complex, they both got different ways of thinking. I'm getting less and less articulate, so I'll stop there. All right, so not seeing a ton of new questions yet, so I've got two more that were asked this morning, and then I'm going to try to touch on. So if you guys want me to talk anymore, throw some more up. Mallory asked this question: can you speak more about this Christian freedom in political conversations, i.e. how to give space for people to have their own opinions, but also to have constructive conversations where each person is willing to learn from one another? My primary piece of information, or of advice on how to have constructive conversations, is that the best possible arrangement is face-to-face with somebody you are in relationship with, someone who knows you, who understands your body language and your background. Those are the most fruitful conversations that are least likely to escalate into name calling and all the other degradations that tend to happen on social media among strangers or simply acquaintances. So I think those conversations, if we're saying, man, I'm not talking enough about this, the first place to go is talk to your friends. And if all your friends agree with you 100% and there's nothing really to talk about, find somebody else in your family or your wider circle that you have some clue, maybe because of something they post or they've said in the past, and say, hey, can we talk about this? I really want to know how you approach these issues. And what I find is that, I'm a pretty calm person dispositionally myself, but there are issues that come up in these political discussions that get my nerves so on edge that I feel like, I don't know what to say. And if I say something, I'm going to say something I regret. And so it takes a lot of self-control, and it takes a lot of the help of the Holy Spirit, right? To be able to have these conversations in a healthy way. So, start with people face-to-face, people on the phone, or maybe, if you want to do something online, do something like what we're doing here, but with more people, like a Zoom call. Say, hey, let's get together and talk about this in our small group or community group or whatever. The community group questions, I went ahead and did community group questions for tonight. I wasn't supposed to do that, but there are some on the website. So if you really want to discuss it, they are up there tonight. Make sure I'm answering Mallory's question. Another recommendation. So obviously I love books, and a book that I read 2 or 3 years ago that I think is brilliant, by a scholar that I've been reading for many years. It's called How to Think by Alan Jacobs. How to Think by Alan Jacobs. And he's a professor, I think now, he was at Wheaton, now he's at Baylor out in Texas, Corey's alma mater, I believe. And Alan Jacobs, it's a short little book, It's not so much like here's a comprehensive approach to thinking, but it's particularly about how we think about issues where we disagree. And a handful of things that I'll just mention one thing that I remember from the book that just is so consistent with the biblical vision for how people ought to operate, but that there's a discipline to having constructive conversations that works extra hard to understand what the other person is saying and why. But before you critique it, before you say, yeah, but what about, to say, no, like, help me understand this, even restating their position. And when you can restate someone's position in terms that they say, yes, that's exactly what I'm saying, then you're in a position to have a constructive dialogue. It takes a lot of time. It takes more work to have conversations like that. It takes more questions, more chin scratching moments of silence. But I think those are ultimately going to be much more constructive. So lots more we could say about that. Maybe we'll come back to that. Here's just one more from this morning. Jackson asked this, do y'all, that was Abram and Latanya and me, notice any idols present in the broader church's political discourse in America? Any idols present in the broader church's political discourse in America? That is a big, deep question. Of course, an idol biblically is anything that we look to give us what only God can give. And ultimately, to judge something an idol in an individual's heart is something you can't really do. They have to understand that. I don't know what's in another person's heart. But sometimes I think, just like we were talking about this morning, where sin works its way into structures, this is in many ways the whole concept of the world in the New Testament, where the world is contrasted with the life of the Spirit, right? The world is the life set against God, the life in the flesh set against God, as it's sort of systematized and institutionalized in the structures around us. And so the world can have common themes, common idols. And in American political discourse, I think one of the biggest ones is nationalism, pure and simple. Nationalism, the idea that the state is a sort of an ultimate good, and that everything else, every other priority that we could have is subordinate to the good of the nation. It sounds like patriotism, but I believe it's different than patriotism. Nationalism is effectively idolizing the state, idolizing the country. So you can red, white, and blue, Lee Greenwood, 4th of July, get excited, be proud to be an American, and all of that, be patriotic about being an American without necessarily being a nationalist. And a nationalist sort of asks America into their heart and defends America at all costs. And I think a lot of times for Christians, there's this, I don't know how many people explicitly think this, but there's this sort of implicit idea that America's kind of like Israel, like we're God's chosen people. And even though Christianity had a huge influence on the founding of the United States, we're not a Christian nation. And we can't equate ourselves that way. And frankly, that biblically, at the coming of Christ and the sending of the Spirit to all nations means that there isn't a single nation that is God's people anymore. We're scattered through every nation. So America can't claim that kind of exceptionalism. So I think nationalism is a big one, and it's alive and well in our country as well. Maybe I'll name one other idol that, isms, these tend to be pretty big and vague, but I think it's worth naming. Oh man, it just slipped out of my head. Not tribalism. That's embarrassing. It's a good thing we have this recorded. Maybe I'll remember and come back to that later. But I think I see some comments coming up here. Okay, well, let's see. Oh yeah. All right. Here's a question from Christy. How do you pursue relationships with people of color without making it feel like you're, to quote the attender mentioned in my sermon earlier, filling a diversity quota? I don't want to pursue those relationships so I just can feel better about myself. Great question, man. I wish we'd gotten that one this morning with Latanya and Abram. My sense is that people are people, and we want to be known, and not just, hey, we're glad you're here. And so I think the thing that makes the difference between that feeling of like, you're smiling at me and hoping that I'll stay here because I feel a diversity, you're trying to fulfill a diversity quota. I think the difference between that feeling and genuine relationship that's back and forth is do you stay? Do you ask more questions? Do you invite to lunch? Do you invite into your home? Is there an interest in a relationship? So I think, just like at the beginning of any relationship, there's always awkwardness. I think that's another thing. And frankly, I think it's part of what's hard for white people, because in all white environments, we have this, we know a lot of the cultural expectations. And so we can quote the same movies and the same music and talk about there's all this common cultural vernacular that makes it easy to relate to somebody. But when somebody with a different race, different culture that may have some totally different experiences than you, all of a sudden you feel like, I don't know how to do this. And we don't like to do anything we don't feel good about. I'm not excited about doing this Q&A because there's already a ton of questions that I'm weak in, but we push through that awkwardness for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of love. So I think people, and maybe people of color on the thread might even speak to this, but I think people know the difference between I'm pushing through the awkward because I want to know you versus I'm not willing to push through the awkward, but I'm glad you're here because, I feel less racist with people of color around. So hopefully that's a start at that one. Patty asked this question that somebody asked similarly this morning. Where do you think we can receive the most accurate, unbiased news? Does that even exist? How do you inform yourself? To my knowledge, there is not a single source that is the most accurate, the most unbiased. So my strategy is not ever to limit myself to one source and to try to sample all around publication, if it's Fox News and MSNBC or the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal or whatever, like trying to get perspectives that you might expect would be different to maybe get a fuller picture of things. So that takes more work than if there's just sort of one reliable source that you could always trust, but it seems to be wiser in my experience. Okay, this is from a friend of John's who writes this question. How/where do you have the opportunity to have actual conversations on all sides of an issue? We have all retreated into our tribes. It's hard even to know where to start. What a great question. Tribalism is one of the broader themes that I think is undermining our ability to move toward peace and justice in our country right now. And I'm planning to preach on that and kind of the denominational aspect within the church as well. Man, how and where do you do that on all sides of an issue? I don't know if I have seen a sort of grand plan that puts everything and everybody on the table. I mean, honestly, we're not even doing it right now, right? Like if we really wanted a lot of different opinions represented, there'd be a whole lot more people on this thread. So I guess my thought is we just have to start somewhere. Start with the nearest person to you that's not like you, and hopefully build from there. And then maybe the two of you find that, well, you disagree about these things, but you found some common ground here and you want to invite somebody else into that discussion. So I don't know why I'm thinking of Dave Ramsey's debt snowball thing, but maybe there's a sort of a civility and constructive dialogue snowball that we can do, just start with one or two and pull in others as well. Okay. Okay, somebody asked, what was my reaction to Trump holding the Bible at the church? I thought it was terrible. Uh, I mean, now let me say this: whenever we talk about a specific politician, uh, it's easy to say, well, if I'm going to criticize one thing about him, then I'm by definition criticizing everything else about his presidency. So can we just agree that we're talking about this one instance? There's one instance where a man who said very repeatedly that he's not religious, he's not shown any strong evidence of being a religious observer, attender in worship. He's been interviewed on camera for saying he doesn't need to ask God for forgiveness because he doesn't do anything wrong. For him to walk outside of a church for I don't think there's any other purpose I've read other than it being a photo op, and to hold up a Bible, it seemed very, very disingenuous, and all the events surrounding it with the park police clearing the crowd with chemical spray or something like that, and I mean it was just it was a mess, and I watched a Fox News broadcast on that to see if, okay, what am I missing here? And the particular commentators that were commentating on it, actually, two were very critical of his action, and one was defending him. And the one that was defending him wasn't very persuasive to me. So, yeah. All right. How do we as a church fight cancel culture? For example, Drew Brees' comments on the flag, just donated $5 million to the city of New Orleans, but was immediately canceled on Twitter by saying he disagrees with not standing for the national anthem. Perhaps not the best timing for his comment, but how do we fight the cancel culture that doesn't lead to true repentance, but simply a quick apology because of outlandish backlash? Man, Connor, I think you're onto something. I had to think about who Drew Brees is. I don't pay attention to sports, but I'm pretty sure he's like a quarterback or something. And I didn't read about his comments on the flag or his donation or any of that. But this moral policing that is going on in our culture, where people cross a certain line and are immediately just sort of erased from the public, is it's hyper legalism, right? I mean, this is a broader thing that I think is fascinating about the moment in history we're in. When I was growing up, the whole narrative of Christians was like, here we are trying to, follow God and live this life of holiness, and everybody else outside the church is trying to just do whatever they want. And what I see increasingly today is that the world outside the church is hyper moralistic. Everybody's pointing a finger at somebody else, and cancel culture is just an extreme example of that. So, man, how do we fight it? Well, maybe again, I'm starting small and thinking of particular ways we can be a part of it. Not doing that in the church with each other, like. One of my biggest fears in talking about these subjects in the last couple of weeks is that there's somebody who disagrees with me in the church. It's just like, that's it. That, our church doesn't care about justice, or our church has gone liberal, or whatever your perspective is, and just like duck out of the conversation and not keep it going. And that's cancel culture. I think it's that same mentality. Like, you've crossed the line and I'm done with you. And I think we have to steadfastly fight that within the church and with each other, not to write each other off like that. So I hope that's a little bit helpful. Oh, wow. Let's see. Jackson asked a really big question. Catch us up to speed on what people label as Marxist theology and how Atlanta Westside is teaching. What is Atlanta Westside is teaching contrast to that? He's not suggesting we teach Marxism. I'm not, like I said, I'm not somebody who's studied a ton of political philosophy and history of all of this. But as I understand Marxism has is a dominant perspective of looking at human life is all about power and who's in power and who's oppressed. And I'm sure there's a lot more particulars about it than that, but how does what Atlanta Westside teaches differ from that? And I'd say this is very broad strokes here, but I tried to articulate this morning. We don't view power as the only explanation for all of reality, right? I mean, who's in power and who's oppressed, who's oppressing, like those are dear to the heart of God, right? Especially throughout the Old Testament, God is constantly calling his people to do justice and love mercy and walk humbly with their God. And he's angry when we're not just with one another. So God cares deeply about justice and the way people relate in power relationships to each other. But he cares about holiness. And that's why he plants his church in a time in history when his people are under the thumb of pagan governments for centuries. And he says, you can live faithfully in that. And you can live faithfully in a situation in life where you're being mistreated. And while we work for justice and we work for peace for the sake of the gospel, like I said this morning, we don't view that as the ultimate lens on reality or the ultimate judgment of what's good or evil. So Jackson, I wish I could give a more scholarly answer to that, but that's my best shot for tonight. Let's see. Oh, so thanks, Corey. Corey told me he's texted me a few more as well. Oh yeah, bunch of, okay. Let's see. Katie asked, what are tools or best strategies for staying factually informed with current events without feeding political agenda setting in the media? It's kind of related to a question earlier about most reliable sources that I think Patty asked. And one thing I'm increasingly suspicious of is the sort of echo chambers of our Facebook pages. And I know, like, I mean, personally, whenever somebody outside of my religious, theological, ideological kind of tribe sends me a friend request on Facebook, or I see them pop up, like I always want to friend them so that they get into my feed. But honestly, I don't know what Facebook's algorithms are for like what they put in my feed, and I try not to spend hours on it anyway. So I have a suspicion that there's an echo chamber effect that tends to keep putting in front of us the people that are sharing a lot of a common view. I might be wrong about that, but I would say the practical outworking of what I'm saying is don't rely on your social media feed to give you an accurate picture of what's going on in the world. Like I said earlier, bounce around to different publications. One publication I've been subscribing to for, 15 years probably now is called The Week. It originated in the UK, and it's kind of a news aggregator. It's a weekly magazine. I get it on my iPad now. And on any given story, it will quote 4 or 5 different publications from across the kind of ideological spectrum. And so you get a good sense of what's going on from multiple perspectives. And I've always appreciated The Week. So hopefully that helps a little bit. And again, I keep coming back to talk to somebody. You hear a conversation at the water cooler, if we were at water coolers, over a Zoom call, somebody makes a comment, you're like, oh, they're different than me. Pursue that person. Follow up, ask a question. So, great questions. All right, I need to look at Slack as well. Boy, I've got a lot of channels to follow here, and y'all are going to have to look at a guy reading for a minute. Hey, Mary. Mary has a question. While a lot of the cultural discussion and opinions against racial injustice seems to be moving in a good direction right now, what are some areas in which the church should maybe push back against what culture is saying right now? So if I think maybe the broader thing Mary is asking, and I'm a lot of the emails in my inbox seem to be touching on this, is sort of what's the church's relationship to the world, right? A lot of people, if I use a term that's being used popularly in the media, especially on the left, people are saying, are quick to say, you're becoming worldly, or you're adapting ideas that are not exclusively biblical. So I think that concern for, okay, if they're positive trends, a lot of people right now are getting much more concerned about racial injustice. What are some of the negatives that could be out there? And well, I mean, of course they're out there. I'd say for one, also one of the criticisms of that people have sent me some videos and podcasts from African Americans that are more on the conservative end of the spectrum, and the criticism is something like this: if white America keeps talking about how much compassion they have for the suffering of Black people, you're effectively reinforcing this victim narrative in our lives, and you're not emphasizing enough individual freedom, free choice, and our ability to make choices that can change our lives. And so I'd say, the extent to which we talk about sin taking root in institutions and structures, I'd say maybe one danger is that that narrative could become a kind of determinism that says, because you are a person of color, or an African American in particular, and you live in a country that has these systemic problems, then by necessity, your life is going to turn out poorly. And of course, that's not true. And not just because people have agency, but because of God's grace. And not only God's grace and people that obey him and follow him, but God's common grace that he gives to all kinds of people. So I think that might be one area, Mary, that we need to watch, is that we don't drift into a determinism or feeding a victim mentality in those who have been victims of injustice, but honoring them and fighting against those real forces while also respecting their ability to participate in their own change. So I hope that made a little sense. Okay, here we go. So Jennifer Tim asks, racial unity has been a goal for Westside for a while. Do you and the elders see a change in the strategy to how we pursue this? Do we have any new concrete steps we're pursuing or exploring to be a better bridge? Man, we could talk for the rest of the night about this one. The short answer is yes. One of the strategies we've been pursuing for some time is making incremental changes in how we do worship, and that started when Gladwell was on staff with us. I think those changes, while positive, are probably not enough to make enough of a difference in the culture of our church to really move the needle in terms of multi-ethnic worship. So before COVID-19 hit, we had started drafting a job description for a worship leader that would ultimately be the main worship leader. Right now, Jeff Heck and Alex Fleeman are kind of splitting things up. It's very, very part-time for them. But somebody that could come in at least half-time and have the musical skill and the cultural background to move us more deliberately in our corporate worship in that direction. So that's one of the big strategies. And just this past Thursday, and even in meetings this afternoon, the majority of our elders are going to be going through some, for lack of a better term, whiteness awareness training, understanding the history of racism in our country and some of the forces that have shaped those of us who are white. So that we have two non-white elders, but the white elders, the majority of us, are going to go through this training over the summer with two very skilled and knowledgeable members of our congregation. And then I'm still working out the details, but we're also planning to hopefully you'll hear some news about this in the next few days, have an open kind of invitation, 6-week video discussion group on this book I've mentioned a while back, Jamar Tisby's book, The Color of Compromise. So Jamar wrote this book a couple of years ago, and he just came out on Amazon Prime Video with these 12 20-minute videos that are sort of more documentary style, walking through the content of the book. And so we're going to invite anybody who wants to be a part of those discussions. We still need to work out with Zoom and some smaller in-person meetings in the coming weeks. Like, how does that work logistically? But that's one of the ways that we're going to try to help the congregation, especially the majority white part of the congregation, to educate and discuss and wrestle with these issues, so that it's not just that we're changing the demographics of the people who show up, but we're actually changing our own hearts in the way that we all approach the subject. So those are some of the ways, some of the strategies that we're seeking to grow. And yeah. Okay. Diane asked, do you see a trend in many historically mainline churches trying to be more people pleasers as opposed to being biblically faithful when God's word has hard things to say to us as sinners, or choosing to advance their reputation as social warriors, advocating the values of the world versus servants of the cross and God's values? I don't follow closely the historically mainline churches, and I don't think I'm qualified to talk about what the trends are there. I think we all have a tendency to be people pleasers. Being biblically faithful is not easy for anyone. And I mentioned this morning virtue signaling. We all want to be perceived as good people in the world, and there's things that if you believe them, including what I'm going to talk about this coming week, that just announcing that I believe them to the world is going to make me disliked. So I think that's all I could say about mainline churches. Just I see those same tendencies in most churches, including ours. All right, I need to go over to the Slack channel. Corey's telling me so I don't forget some of these questions. Okay. Here's a question. Following up on Jackson's question about Marxism. Some Christians call any conversation about racial justice Marxist. What do you think about that? Is the assumption that capitalism is Christian? I think that assumption often is made, that capitalism is Christian. But maybe the most problematic thing that Jen is bringing up is that to simply raise these subjects can often get you labeled as being a part of a larger system of thought that you may completely disagree with. So I think as Christians, we ought not to be people doing that. So if I hear you quoting Karl Marx, I should not therefore assume that you are a Marxist. I've quoted Friedrich Nietzsche in my sermons, and I'm not a Nietzschean atheist, right? So I think we have to be very careful making judgments about someone's entire way of seeing the world based on language they use, terminology they use. This related to the discussion about race right now is a larger movement known as critical race theory. And there's some Christians that are raising alarms and saying that the critical race theory is based on a Marxist view of the world, and therefore some of the terminology that emerges out of the critical race theory movement, like white privilege or white supremacy, is therefore swallowing whole all the ideology of Marxism. And I don't think that's fair. And I think the Christians that I listen to, the Christians that I trust, who are using language like white privilege or white supremacy, are using it because they find it to helpfully express a real thing that really does fit with the Bible's view of the world. And you have to give them a chance to explain that, just as anybody wants a chance to explain what they believe. So back to the call for patience. Okay. last call here. I want to save time and space for next week if people want to do this again. Michael says, how do we view communities of color without being colorblind, but also not view them too monolithically, basically attributing some ideas as complete consensus of that whole community? Wow, great question. So, in other words, we don't want to be colorblind in the sense of we don't want to act as if your race is irrelevant to who you are as a person. God created you, gave you the race that you have. And so color blindness is a way of, in some ways, kind of bracketing off and saying, I'm not going to pay attention to that. That's not actually love. But what Michael is saying, okay, if we are paying attention to race, we're saying, yes, you're Black. How do we do that in a way, or you're Asian, or you're Hispanic, or Indian, or whatever? How do you do that in a way that's not assuming that, well, because you're Black or Asian or some other race, then you must be just like this, right? And I don't know about you guys. I've been bumping into that even in the last week. So like I've talked to some of my Black friends and approached them from the assumption that they're really hurting and sad. And that's the vast majority of them would agree with that. But I've approached some and they've said, man, I'm just tired of this, and I don't want to talk about it, and it's depressing me. Or I've talked to some others that I've thought would be sad, and they are spitting mad, like screaming into the phone, and not mad at me, but they're just so angry. And so, I feel like this is such a simplistic answer, but I keep coming back to it. I mean, it comes back to paying attention to the person in front of you. I think you take what you maybe know in general that you're hearing. The vast majority of African Americans right now are really feeling this, and you kind of walk in with a sensitivity to that. But if they give you a different perspective in terms of what they're experiencing, you got to be open to that and ask more questions and dive into what they're really going through. So it's a great question, Michael. I'm really glad you asked it. All right, we've got a couple more, and maybe we'll wrap it up after. I got one from Mateo and one from Jeff. So Mateo said, who are these people of color who are white people? These terms are used a lot, but I don't understand who they reference as their biblical perspective on names for different groups. Wow. Oh, that is a big one. And yeah, I mean, biblically, right, the word race, like we're all part of the human race. Ethnicity is a much more accurate term for people of different nations. The ethnos in the Bible are the nations. When you study the literature about racial injustice in America, and even prior to that, most scholars will talk about, whiteness is kind of is a construct, right? There's all kinds of different people groups, ethnicities that make up what is associated with whiteness. So this is a complicated situation, right? Like, so it's true, like people of color is a broad term to designate everybody who's not white. People who are white is it's a broad category of people who kind of are identified with this larger social reality. And I don't know if I'm helping there without a much larger conversation and some more intelligent people to help us out there. So, but Mateo, I just want to say, like, I think that's a great question to get back to sort of the roots of all of this. And it'll help us think more clearly overall. Okay, last question I'll answer tonight, and then we'll close. This is Jeff. In thinking about the church's complicity in racism, I'm comfortable with adhering to the denominational doctrine relative to women's right to preach. Has your position evolved on this at all? Boy, there's a lot there. Actually, okay, so this is one of the reasons why we started this series in 1 Timothy 2. Next week, we're going to go to verses 5 to 7, which address this question of the exclusive claims of the Christian faith. Definitely a third rail there. And then the week after that, we're going to go to one of the most controversial verses about women and teaching and authority in the church, and men as well. And really more broadly in that passage, not focusing strictly on women and teaching in the church, but on how we ought to think about our identity, starting with the sex that we're given at birth. So has my position evolved at all? That's just, yeah, I think we'll just have to come back to that in 2 weeks, but we'll have plenty of time to talk about that. Maybe to give you, not to be super cagey about it. My position is always evolving, but I'd prefer the word refining, in the sense that Scripture is my authority. And so I'm constantly going back to Scripture saying, am I reading this right? Am I missing something here? And as the more I study it, the more it's like the doctrine that I understand, there's always at least some, rough edge that's keeps getting knocked off. So lots of rough edges on my understanding of women in the church continue to be knocked off. Though my basic position has not changed at this point. And we'll talk about that in a couple weeks. So John Beeler asked, would Jesus be on social media if it existed in 30 AD? I don't know, probably. Jesus loves people. People are on social media. Seems like you might want to be connected with them somehow. That's a good, fun little thought for us to go to sleep to. So thank you all for participating. We didn't know if anybody would show up to this. And I guess it's going to be recorded. Maybe somebody will want to watch it later. Let's keep the conversation going. Thanks, y'all. Good night.